ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Jonathan Haidt is a best-selling author and professor of ethical leadership at New York University's Stern School of Business. John is curious about how technology is changing us, and he's become one of the leading voices warning about the dangers of social media for children and teenagers. When John's book, The Anxious Generation, was published earlier this year, it very quickly became one of those books that parents and teachers, and it turns out politicians, kept talking about with one another. John argues that the story isn't confined to smartphones and social media. He sees the use of this technology as part of a much wider and far-reaching transformation of the human experience. An experiment, if you will, where Gen Z are the guinea pigs for all of us. Hi, John. Welcome to Conversations.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm very happy to be here. We've got a lot to talk about, and I'm glad to hear we have a lot of time to talk about it.
You are a social psychologist by trade. What does that mean?
So a cognitive psychologist studies how people reason, how cognition works. A developmental psychologist studies how children change and develop. And a social psychologist studies how people influence each other, how we have a lot of built-in software, you might say, for how we position ourselves in society, how we seek for prestige. A lot of this is shaped by culture, but there are some very powerful, evolved systems in there. And this is important. I think I bring something new to this topic because most of the people studying it don't seem to have fully grappled with the incredible social addiction, the pressure that young people feel. My students, when I say, okay, you tell me you're on TikTok and social media for 4 or 5 hours a day, why don't you get off? And they all say the same thing. They don't say anything about the benefits of it. They always say, I can't because everyone else is on it. So a social psychologist is very tuned in to the way we affect each other in that, like that.
Let me ask, before we get on to teenagers, about your own personal experience with this technology, because really all of us are part of this kind of giant technological experiment, it feels. When did you first get an iPhone?
Oh, I got the iPhone 2 in 2008, and my son was 2 years old at the time. And the fact that he loved it and he could figure out, you touch what you want, you get what you want. The fact that I didn't, on that day, sell all of my retirement investments and put them all into Apple is one of my biggest regrets in life, because it was clear, wow, they're really onto something with this interface, this technology. I've always been a techno optimist. I love technology. I've always loved, electronics and wiring things up. I'm not like a Luddite. I'm not a person who dislikes technology. And I should add that for me, it's not really a personal issue in my own use, because my phone is still just a Swiss Army knife. That first iPhone was a Swiss Army knife.
What do you mean,
What
do you mean by Swiss Army knife?
So a Swiss Army knife is this amazing thing that has all these tools on it. If you need a knife, you pull out the knife. If you need a screwdriver, has a corkscrew. You need to open a wine bottle, go get your Swiss Army knife. I used to have huge, like when I was a kid, I loved them. I have one had a magnifying glass on it, had tweezers. So the iPhone was originally very much like that. It was a small, attractive device. And as Steve Jobs said, it's a phone, it's an iPod, and it's an internet communication device. It's all three things in one. But that's not all, folks. It also has maps, and it had a calculator, and it had a flashlight. For God's sakes, the thing had a flashlight.
It never had a corkscrew, though, John.
They haven't yet figured out how to open a wine bottle with a phone. That's true. But I'm sure someone will have a service. They'll send one by a drone and open your wine bottle for you. Anyway, my point is, tools are amazing. When there's a tool that we can use to meet our goals, that's great. That's what technology does for us. But after you get push notifications, the App Store, over time, especially in the early 2010s, it becomes more of a master. It becomes a thing that is always interrupting us. You walk around any city, everyone's got a phone in their hand. People are looking at it while they're walking. So it's become something of a master. But I should just say, I don't really have a problem with it because I'm always on my computer. So I'm always multitasking on my computer. I have problems there. I have problems focusing. But no, this isn't because I personally addicted.
No, I think it's salutary to kind of remind ourselves of how quickly that technology developed. So as you say, when it first appears, I can make a phone call, I can listen to music, I can look at a map. But then in rapid succession, there are those developments that you point out, like the front-facing phone and social media. So suddenly it becomes a very different piece of technology in our hands.
Yeah, that's right. So actually, let me set this in a slightly larger historical context, because you're right. You're pointing to this crucial 5-year period, 2010 to 2015, when everything changes. But I think it helps to go back to the early 90s. And so older listeners, I'm 61, and I was a young man when the internet came out. And I'll never forget the first day. It was in 1994. I was back at the University of Pennsylvania for a postdoc, and I had a little office, and I had a computer, and somebody showed me, said, "Hey, have you tried Alta Vista?" And that was one of the first web browsers. And he showed me one of these web browsers, and it was like, wait, you mean I just type in what I want to know and I can know anything instantly? I mean, it takes a second or two, but how can this be? This is like God giving us omniscience. It was amazing. And so the internet was really amazing. And the millennials grew up with the internet and they loved it and they're fine. And they started companies. They learned how to program. They learned how to take apart computers. So the 90s was this period of incredible techno-optimism around the internet. But two things to note. One is that the internet was not controlled by a couple of companies. In fact, it was very difficult to make money with the internet. Originally, it was just sort of one way. You put stuff up, but you couldn't really use credit cards early on. So it was very distributed, sort of utopian, fun, and also it just seemed to really be an obvious friend of democracy, because it really was just about people connecting with each other. And so we all thought, this is going to take down dictators. China can never keep this out. Good luck, China, keeping out the internet. Of course, they did figure out how to do it, sort of. So I'm putting this in historical context to make it clear how we got tricked, because it was so marvelous. Everyone loved it. There were some downsides, but the upsides obviously overwhelmed the downsides. That was clear to everyone in the 90s. Then you go into the 2000s, and now things are getting faster. Early, you couldn't do, even photos were hard because speeds were so slow. But then you get video, you begin to get video in the 2000s. And now you begin to get a couple of companies beginning to control things. The social media companies are fighting for dominance. But it still is all free. It's not even an advertising model quite yet. And so all the way up to 2009, we think, well, this is all just great. And the early platforms were called social networking systems because you could connect with someone and look at their profile. This is all very innocent. And then in 2009, things begin to change. Twitter adds the retweet button, and Facebook copies it with the share button. Facebook invents the like button, and everybody copies it with a like button. So now the companies are getting a huge amount of information from each user, and now they can begin using algorithms to guide what they called the news feed. You didn't have that in the 90s. You have a personal news feed. So it's much more engaging, much more gripping. It's chosen just for you by AI. And then you also get the front-facing camera. You get Instagram. You get high-speed data. So in 2010, very few young people had a smartphone. They mostly had flip phones. By 2015, almost everyone has a smartphone with an Instagram account, front-facing camera, and a news feed that feeds them stuff. So it's unrecognizable. That, I think, is what we all need to grapple with. That's when things changed. It's
important to remind us, I think, about what exactly is going on in a teenage brain that makes this sort of technology so seductive. Put those in context for me, this technology and what's happening with us neurologically at 15, 16.
So one thing we can say for sure about human beings is that they care about their reputation. We are an ultra-social species. We live or die or succeed based on what other people think of us, especially in ancient times when if you're not in good with the group, if you're annoying people and they expel you, you're dead. So we have a lot of deep wiring to manage our reputations. This is why we're very good at hypocrisy. We're very good at lying and then believing our lies, because we're descended from the people who did this successfully. And that's what my second book, The Righteous Mind, was about, our moral cognition. So this is especially powerful in teenagers. When you're a kid, you're playing, it's fun, it's not about your reputation. But gradually, things get more serious. And you get cliques and you get exclusion and you get mean girls and you get, you hit in America, you hit middle school, you change schools around the beginning of puberty, around age 10, 11, you go to middle school, we call it. And suddenly it's all about like who's in, who's out. So adolescents are very insecure, very concerned about their reputation. So girls and boys are different in some ways. So let's just talk about girls because that's where it's clearest. If you want to trap a girl, what would you do? A trap is almost by definition, you have bait that an animal likes, and then once they take the bait, then they can't escape the trap. That's how you trap an animal. So if you want to trap girls and exploit them as customers, as sexual objects, whatever, what you would do is you would bait the trap with social information. You would say, hey, do you want to know what Mary said about Jennifer? Do you want to know what Jennifer said about you? Hey, people are talking about this thing. Do you want to know or do you not care? Like, no, I want to know. Girls have a more developed social map. They remember more. They're more interested in the network of relationships. So social media offered girls a way to do all of this. And then once girls go in, especially on Instagram, then no one can escape because it takes over as the communication network. And now if any girl tries to leave, she's totally alone. And then once they're in, it does many, many things to them. The most obvious is if you're on for 3, 4, 5 hours a day. Now, 5 hours a day is the average amount of time that American teenagers are on. 5 hours a day. That's in addition to school and everything else you have to do. So basically, it pushes out almost everything else. Whatever you did in childhood, older people listening, whatever you did in childhood, knock out 70% of that. There's no time for that. You're going to be on social media looking at posts and especially consuming short videos. But then aside from this opportunity cost of pushing out, you get chronic social comparison. You're not comparing yourself to the 20 other girls in your class. You're comparing yourself to literally millions of girls and young women who were selected by algorithm for having the most perfect lives. So it's just a really powerful tool for making girls feel inadequate, ugly, overweight. I mean, it's horrible what it does to teenage girls.
How clear, John, is the data around the real-world impact on the mental health of teenagers, particularly teenage girls, from this sort of scenario that you've just described?
The trends in mental health, I have a lot of data. If you go to my Substack, afterbabble.com, there's all kinds of posts on America, Australia, New Zealand. We have a lot of stuff on the Anglosphere and also on Europe. And what we see is that there were no real trends in mental health stats from the late 90s through about 2010, even 2011. There's nothing going on. There's no big up or down. And all of a sudden, it's as though someone turned on a light switch and girls all over the Anglo world especially started checking into psychiatric emergency wards. I mean, it's very sudden in America. It's really 2013. And all the Anglo countries is right around then. And there's no other explanation for this. No one has even offered another theory to explain it other than the technology change. The social media was the big thing. But that's just a correlation.
Could it be that teenagers are now more likely to be reporting mental health issues? You know, they're more likely to seek help than they were in earlier generations?
No, I mean, that's a very plausible thing to say. And of course, it's true that that's happened. But if that was what was driving these changes, then what we would see is a gradual change since the 1990s. I mean, mental illness was very stigmatized when I was a kid, but since the 90s, it's been very steadily destigmatized. So it's not as though that, you wouldn't see nothing and then suddenly synchronized international change. So that's what first alerted me to this. And that is a kind of evidence. It's a correlational. It doesn't prove causality. Maybe something else changed around the world. I mean, nobody can point to that thing. Maybe there is some new chemical that was sprinkled over Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, Britain, and Northern Europe. I mean, maybe they'll find that, but so far no one has a candidate for it. The second kind of evidence is that the kids themselves say it. You ask Gen Z, ask them what effect this has on them. And you find, and we've got them on the Substack, you've got these really powerful, moving, sad narratives about the loss of my childhood, about what it did to me, about the years of eating disorders. You find story after story from young people saying, this thing messed me up. This is messing up our generation. Now, some of my critics say, those are just anecdotes. Those are just Really? Those are just anecdotes? Go find me some anecdotes on the other side. Go find me where are all the Gen Z people saying, no, we love social media. Don't put an age limit on it. We love it. Like, I can't find them. And then you ask the parents. Have you ever heard a parent say, my child was kind of shy and withdrawn, Then I gave her a phone and Instagram. She really blossomed. And she's healthy. She's happy. Like, no, you don't find parents saying that.
Do you find parents saying that perhaps of neurodivergent kids? Are there instances where kids find the actual world of social interactions really overwhelming or challenging, and maybe they find a community online that they wouldn't in the school playground or elsewhere?
That is the one. So that is the one place where I think it is quite possible, and I just don't know enough to say. But just in terms of the stories I've heard, especially for kids with autism, who have a lot of difficulty making friends, they do gravitate more to devices. They're high systemizers. They find it very congenial. And so I haven't seen the data on this, but I'm very willing to believe that this kind of communication is good for neurodivergent kids. But now let's be clear. By this kind of communication, I don't mean the short videos that, TikTok. I don't mean a news feed sending you tailored stuff for you. I mean being able to talk or chat or type or text over the internet. So I do think that neurodivergent kids are different, but we'll talk. Dopamine's a whole big other subject. We'll get to that. But if you have a kid with autism and you say, oh, well, video games are the one way that he makes friends, and that might be true, but you really have to watch any kid, and especially a boy, who is getting lots of quick stimulation, lots of quick dopamine. You are resetting that kid's dopamine system so that when they're not on the video game, everything else is boring. And when you try to take your son to go visit grandma is incredibly boring because she just sits there and moves her mouth. There's nothing blowing up. There's nothing moving. So I would be very careful, but I would just say it is possible that things are different for kids with autism.
If we just stay with some of the questions raised about your thesis just for a second longer, what about the argument that people make of my generation of, the number of times my parents told me, get off the television, go outside, hit a tennis ball, go for a walk, stop looking at TV. I mean, I watched hours of meaningless television as a kid, John. What's different with social media?
First of all, did you ever watch 16 hours of television in a day?
No, that I can probably say no to.
You couldn't do that. But once, and with the early internet, you couldn't do that either. You couldn't be on the early internet for 16 hours a day because you had to go to school, you had to go to the bathroom, you had to go to dinner. But with
and the
iPhone,
content was not that interesting, I have to say as well. There was also on free to air. Right. There was not. It was just the ABC. I couldn't watch 16 hours of cricket. Yeah.
Well, that's right. And so let's talk about this because this is actually a very important distinction. And the major argument I get, the major pushback I get, and I should point out, there's been almost no pushback. It's astonishing. Almost everybody sees this, although there is a debate with about 8 research psychologists who say that I don't have the evidence. So we'll get to that in a moment. That's a little detailed sort of thing. But television has a number of interesting properties that make it not particularly bad. So the key point that I'm really coming to realize as I've been looking at TikTok more is that stories are good. Humans evolved with stories. We are a storytelling animal. And when kids pay attention to a story for 20 minutes or an hour, a movie, 90 minutes, you get into it, you get transported. And this is a big feature of being a human. So that's great. Television is actually a very effective way to tell stories. And you and I grew up, I'm older than you, but we grew up consuming huge numbers of stories on television. Also, television is presenting a story and it does not ask for a response. And that we thought that was very passive, but it turns out that's good. Because when you're listening to a story, you want to be passive. You want to listen to the story. Now let's look at a device, an iPhone or a tablet, an iPad in the hands of a 9-year-old child. What is this 9-year-old child doing? I guarantee you they're not watching, nature documentaries for 40 minutes. Almost all of what they're doing is multitasking, moving around, short videos. If it gets a little boring, you move on to the next thing. They might say, oh, okay, I should send some text, but then they get distracted. So basically these 2, 3, 4-hour periods are not spent following a story and developing your ability to focus. These periods are shattering your focus. I heard somebody refer to it as attention fracking. What the companies have learned how to do is break up the child's attention into little bits so you can grab every one of them. I'd be very curious to know the number of people who sit on a toilet and don't have a phone with them. I would guess for young people that is now a very, very low number. The new iPhone is waterproof, so some of my students say they take it into the shower. If you can, with a smartphone, you can grab every single bit of attention over the entire day. With a television, you couldn't do that. And there's one more thing I want to point out about television versus a smart device. The behaviorists in psychology, the behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, they discovered that if you can administer a reward to a rat or a pigeon within a second of the behavior, you get very fast learning. You can train a dog or a circus animal to do amazing tricks if you can give them a reward within a second, roughly, of when they did the behavior. Now, as a parent, we would all like to have that. I wish I could train my kids to sit up straight and eat with their mouth, chew with their mouth closed, things like that. But I don't have a behaviorist conditioning device that will do that. And television can't do that. You watch it, if you're bored, what can you do? You can raise the volume, you can lower the volume, that's about it. You can change the channel, that's about it. But with a smart device, the way it works is you see something, you touch it, you get a reward. Touch it, get a reward. And so a smart device is a behaviorist conditioning machine. And so to put this all together, stories are good. If you have your kid consuming stories and paying attention to one story for 20, 40, 80 minutes, that's generally a good thing. Don't be so afraid of that. But if you spend that time giving your kid a behaviorist conditioning device where you don't control the rewards, strangers control it, companies control it, weirdos control it. Like, why would you do that? Why would you give up control of your child's learning to strangers? But that's what we've done.
One of the interesting things about the anxious generation is that there's these two arguments you make. One is about what we've let happen with kids online, and the other is about what we've let happen to kids in the physical world. And that's related to the difference in well-being between boys and girls that you alluded to, because the drop in boys' well-being started showing up earlier in the 1990s. What was changing around boys in particular in the physical world in that decade, in the 90s?
As I was saying before, social media is a real trap for girls. But girls weren't as much on the internet as boys in the 90s. Boys were more attracted to computers. So for a while, until it was more of a boy thing. And then once it gets social, once you get social media, now girls are on it, and they're both on almost all the time. I mean, as much as can possibly be. But the girls' story, it's very sudden, as I said, very sudden around 2012, 2013. But in all those graphs that we've drawn, we often see that the boys, they begin to decline a few years before. It's more gradual. There's not a sudden hockey stick shape at 2012. It's more gradual, and it starts a little earlier. So now let's go back and look at the big picture of boys. If you want to trap a boy, what would you do? It's not going to be, hey, do you want to hear some gossip about what somebody... I mean, they're interested, but not as interested. Boys are especially interested in war and sex. By war, I mean group versus group combat, team sports. Boys will spontaneously organize themselves into teams to compete if there are no adults around. Girls are less likely to do that. So how about if we give boys a way to organize into teams, to fight these incredible battles with huge guns and lasers? And, you know, my son flies on a bomb down into a war zone. I mean, you know, on Fortnite. So video games are a really, really effective way to trap boys. Very few girls are addicted to video games. They play them, but very few have serious problems. But about 10% of boys have behavioral addiction. It's called problematic use. So video games are great for trapping boys. When I was a teenager, Pong came out. You could hook it up to your television. It was pretty cool because it was ping pong, but with a thing on your it was interesting. But, you know, we'd play that and we'd go play something else. And of course, every year, or certainly every 5 years or so, like it gets a lot better. Like the progress in graphics and design and sound and color. The video games are incredible nowadays. And their group, this is the key thing. Once you get internet speeds so fast, once you have the multiplayer games, the boys get lured into that. Now, it does not seem as bad as social media. The boys are actually enjoying it. The girls will say, yeah, social media is hurting us, but I can't quit. The boys will say, I love my video games. Don't take them away. The boys love the video games. But here's the problem. The video games are designed by teams of psychologists with features to hook you, because if they don't hook you, you'll go to a different video game. So they're as addictive as humans can possibly make something. They're exciting. They're fun. And what I've begun to see since writing the book, I didn't say this in the book, but I've seen it since then, is that if we check in on the kids at the age of 14, what we see is that the girls are more anxious and depressed. It's clear that the electronic world is messing them up, eating disorders, all kinds of problems. Whereas the boys, they're having fun playing video games and they're watching a lot of porn. Not all of them, but the porn is amazing. It's free. When I was a kid, there was a rule: you can't have a television in your bedroom. No respectable family would let a kid have a television in the bedroom. That was insane. But now we let them have everything, the internet, all of it in their bedrooms. All of this triggers fast dopamine. All of this is incredibly stimulating. What that means is that the dopamine neurons, the dopamine system, which is part of the reward mechanisms in the brain, that changes in response. It has to downregulate. It has to become less sensitive to dopamine because there's too much of it. And what that means is that then when the kid is not doing something like that, as I said before, then everything is boring. The world becomes boring. So at 14, the girls are doing worse. But if we check in on them at 28, which is what the oldest Gen Z are, now what we see is the girls a lot of them have graduated from college, gotten jobs, and they're not living with their parents. But the boys are much less likely to have graduated from college, university, less likely to get a job, more likely to be living with their parents. They've become losers. So I think in the long run, I think the new phone-based digital childhood is actually hurting boys more than girls.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski. You can find more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
John, in The Anxious Generation, you draw this contrast between what's happening with kids online and what's happened with kids in the physical world. What's that distinction?
Yeah, this is central to the book, that we have overprotected our children in the real world and underprotected them online. So in the real world, the norm always was in all of our countries, at least in the Anglo countries and in Europe, the norm was by age 6 or 7, and certainly by age 8, all kids are out playing. If there was a family that didn't let their 8-year-old kid out, like some people would say, like, wow, we should call the police. Like, what are they doing to that kid? All kids were out. Now, I grew up during the biggest crime wave we've had in the century. There was mugging, there were drunk drivers, but all kids went out and played, and they looked out for each other, and they looked out for threats. And that's important because the world has dangers, and kids seek out danger. It was actually part of the allure of the real world was that there were risks. Kids are drawn to small risks, and it's important that they have them because then they learn how to manage risk. And it used to be that sometimes kids broke arms. Like, most of us older people remember that somebody would come in with a cast and then you'd sign their cast. It's very rare nowadays. Boys are the main people who used to break arms because they were doing crazy things on bicycles. Now, recently, it's become out that teenage boys are the least likely of all men, slightly less likely than their fathers or grandfathers to break an arm because they're not doing anything that involves any risk. So freedom after school, playtime, this is when so much of your social development happens on the playground or wandering around. My best friend and I, we'd wander around town, we'd get ice cream, we stole shopping carts, we could bash off the top and make go-karts. Like, you get into some mischief. And in the 90s in America, we freaked out about child abduction. And we thought that if you ever take your eyes off your child, they will be abducted, because that did happen to a few. I mean, it's extremely rare, but it happened in a horrible case in Florida in 1980. And the father made it his life's mission that this will never happen to anyone else. Let's warn people. Don't let your kids out. Don't let them talk to strangers. This is a terrible thing to teach children. You should teach your children, do talk to strangers. Just be wary when a stranger comes up to you. That you have to be more careful about. But by all means, talk to strangers if you need directions. Don't be afraid to ask for directions. So we freak out in the 90s. And the irony is that in the 90s is when the crime wave ended. It just disappeared. It just vanished. The world gets really safe. We get mothers against drunk driving. Drunk driving rates plunge. The world gets really safe in the 90s. But that's the decade we freaked out. We stopped trusting our neighbors. And we started keeping them in. But that's okay, because now we have this amazing internet. And the boys are happy with it because they have these amazing video games. Now, in the 90s, a boy had to go over another boy's house to play video games. So they were still social. Of course, now a boy can't go over to his friend's house. If you go to your friend's house, you can't play video games. You have to go home and put on your headset, your controller. So we began overprotecting. But it wasn't just American crime, because the same thing happens in Britain and Canada. Now, Australia, I don't have data on the overprotection there. But in Britain and Canada, they also freaked out, started overprotecting their kids. And that's in part because we lost trust in our neighbors for all the reasons that Robert Putnam wrote this famous book, Bowling Alone, about the decline of social capital. So all the Anglo countries have a lot in common with each other. I'm really interested in a kind of a pan-Anglo, information sphere, because we have similar institutions, similar values, and now similar problems.
Tell me why you consider the almost completely vanished playground spinner to be the greatest piece of playground equipment ever invented.
Well, it's in part just because I have such fond memories of it as being exciting. So maybe use different words in Australia, but it's this device that many have seen where it's a big circle, maybe 10 feet across, metal with handles on it, and you can't really push it by yourself. But if you get a few kids together, you can push it. It's heavy. You push it. It has a lot of momentum, and then you all jump on, and you're spinning, and everybody's shrieking, and everybody's laughing. So it's collective. You can't do it yourself. That's important. It's consciousness alteration. It's like, I guess that you could call dizziness the gateway drug to all other drugs, I suppose. It's consciousness alteration. It is a little risky. You can get hurt on it. And you have to especially watch out for people dangling their heads off, because if you dangle your head off and then some kid walks up, you could actually hit your head hard. Again, risk is a feature, not a bug. And so it's exciting. And one thing I learned in writing the book is kids need thrills. They don't just need fun. They need thrills. And a thrill is both fear and enjoyment. And so the playground spinner is really unusual. It's a really unusual toy.
But it's, that the urge to protect our kids, which is such a fundamental urge that every parent has, it can then, from what you were saying as a social psychologist around teens, it's difficult for teens to go be outliers and do something different from other teens. The same for parents, when every other kid is being driven to school, or every other kid's not allowed to wander around the neighbourhood. It can feel risky as a parent. Was that something you and your wife struggled with in your own parenting?
Yes, absolutely. And so let's talk about this. I'm curious whether it's the same in Australia. So it used to be, all the way through the 70s and into the 80s. Well, certainly before the 70s, women largely were not working. Women were largely in the home. Men were out working. And that was actually good for kids in the sense that kids could be out playing, and we all trusted them out there because we knew there are a lot of mothers around. If anything happens, there are adults, someone will help. And then women begin entering the workforce much more in the 80s. And it's not specifically because of that, but I'm just saying the environment changes so that now we feel there's not eyes on the street anymore, to use Jane Jacobs' phrase about city life. We stop trusting our neighbors and trusting society. And there's a really interesting graph in the book where you see that it's the number of hours spent with your child on a typical day. And the number, I forget what the exact numbers were, but the numbers for women were fairly steady up until around 95. And then all of a sudden around 95, they go up a lot. And women now, American mothers, spend a lot more time with their kids than their mothers or grandmothers did.
Even if they're working outside of the home.
Exactly.
So it's this combined thing.
Exactly. That's right. So American women are working a lot more than their mothers or grandparents did. They have fewer kids than their mothers or grandparents did, yet they are spending more time. That's in part because we didn't used to think of it as your job as a parent is to always be with your child, giving them experiences. That's a crazy idea. The idea was, I'm making the food, I'm doing the laundry, you have your chores, you go play off with your friends. Go with your friends, but I need you back because you have to do these chores. Or, come back in time for dinner. So as norms changed, in America, we developed the idea that a good mother, especially mother, is one who keeps her child safe. Fathers, we cut more slack to. If fathers, he's teaching them to be tough, he's letting them take risks. But mothers are judged very harshly, especially by other mothers, if they ever let their kids take any risks. And we have this horrible thing that's happened. There's just a major case in Georgia a month ago where, I'm a big proponent of free-range childhood. Kids need to be out. Lenore Skenazy wrote the book Free Range Kids. She and I have an organization called Let Grow. And so, but a huge problem in America, and tell me if you have this in Australia, is that if a child is seen outside without a chaperone, someone, it's almost always a woman, will call the police. And they'll say, there's a child out. He could be abducted. There's no adult around because no one has seen a child out since 1991. So they call the police. The police come, and it's up to them what they want to do. And sometimes the police buy into the idea that any child will be kidnapped. Now, there's almost no kidnapping in the United States, almost zero. There's like 100 cases a year of true kidnapping. And so there's this mother in Georgia She went out. She went out to visit someone. She went out to do something. And while she was out, her son, 10-year-old son, a 10-year-old boy, decided to take a walk and go visit a friend. So this kid, 10-year-old kid, goes to walk to visit a friend. The police are called. They catch the kid. They put him in a police car. They bring him home. But that's not the end of it.
Because it's not it's seen as not safe for him to be on the street alone.
This was child endangerment. This was child endangerment. She should have known that her son might go out for a walk. She should have locked him up or made him promise to not leave. I don't know what they were thinking, the police. But they said, it's not safe. You've endangered your child. She said, what? How have I endangered my child? Anyone could have picked him up. Anyone could have kidnapped him. And they say, you mean, wait, my son is 10. He can't go out for a walk? He says, no, they say, show me what law you're breaking. Show me what law you broke. And they say, it's against the law for a 10-year-old child to go out for a walk. Now, that's not literally true, but the police have discretion. So they handcuff her and they take her to jail. Now her kids are alone and she has to call a neighbor to come by.
That is a shocking story, John. Surely that is an exception.
Shocking. It is horrific. That's right.
Is that a harbinger of a more widespread change, or is that even considered by your fellow Americans as an outrageous sort of thing to have happened?
Oh, it is an outrage, but it's common. It's actually common. It's not like it's happening dozens of times a day in the country, but this sort of thing, and we don't know how often it happens. We just know the stories that make the news come out every few months. But the point is that there's a widespread idea in America. We're a giant, diverse country with a lot of crime, a lot of guns. There's an idea that if a child is not watched, he will be killed or raped or something like that, which is a terrible way to raise kids. And so we freaked out. And as you were saying before, parents, and again, especially mothers, the pressure's on mothers. So many mothers say they want to have a free range. They want to let their kids out. They're not afraid of kidnappers. They're afraid of other parents. They're afraid of other people calling the police.
But it's interesting, your previous book to this one looked at the kind of consequences for this approach to parenting for by the time kids become young adults and you meet them in university courses, in college courses. How is this overprotection in the physical world playing out, do you think, by the time kids are in their early 20s and launching, hopefully, into their own lives?
So, right, my previous book, The Coddling of the American Mind, focused on overprotection. Coddling means overprotection. So if kids have been overprotected since they're little, not being let out into the real world where they can take risks and grow and learn not to get hurt, this is depriving them of life skills, of confidence. So the overprotection is a major contributor to the mental health crisis, I believe, especially in the United States where we're very overprotective. But the funny thing is that mental health stats didn't really begin to drop until 2012. It wasn't a gradual thing with the rise of overprotection. So I think the overprotection weakened kids, but it didn't destroy their mental health. It just weakened them. And then when they got online, when they started, not, online an hour a day on your parents' computer, but when they had their own phone with their own internet access, they could be on literally 10 hours a day. That's when mental health collapses. Now, the two pieces of the story are intertwined because once we stopped letting kids out into the real world, all there was left for them were screens, and the screens got better and better, cooler and cooler. So the overprotection drives the screen addiction, but the screen addiction drives the not going out because nothing out there is as interesting as a video game or porn or social media. So the screens basically attract the kids, and now that's given us what I call a phone-based childhood. Where mammals have always had a play-based childhood. It's almost the definition of a mammal, of course, is mammary glands, milk, long childhood, high investment in the child. That's the mammal thing. That's why mammals are successful. But that means long childhood, all mammals play. Puppies play, kittens play. They need to play a lot in order to wire up their brain. And early on we thought, well, okay, they're not out on a playground spinner, but they're playing video games. They're communicating. Maybe it's okay. Maybe it's even better, we thought. But now it turns out, no, it's not better. It's much, much worse because we evolved to need to move in the three-dimensional world, the five senses world. We evolved to need a lot of eye contact, a lot of shared touch, physical touch, shared laughter. These are all things that older people remember from childhood. But many members of Gen Z, if most of your interactions over a screen, there's no touch. You're not touching your friends ever. You're not I remember, putting my arm around friends, or we wrestled a lot. There's no touch. There's very little shared laughter. I remember laughing with my friends a lot, but when you're on separate screens in separate places, you're not laughing with your friends. It's not synchronized. So the overprotection in the real world has sort of driven, the underprotection online, the pushing online, and vice versa. It's a big mess. We have to get out of it. We have to get out of both at the same time.
One of the big differences too that you're just describing, that sort of physical world versus the digital world, is just the number of interactions. Like you're with your friends, it might be 2 or 3 or maybe a gang of 7 or 8 around the neighbourhood, but that's such a different, feels much more manageable set of interrelationships than that very open, fluid sort of relationships we encounter in the online world.
So networks are very useful things for adults, and technology helps us network. Kids don't need to network. Kids need to develop friends. And what they really need is 1, 2, or 3, some small number of close friends. If a kid has a couple of close friends, even one best friend, even one close friend, they're probably going to do okay. And if a kid doesn't have close friends, they're probably not going to do okay. So what happens? Once everything moves online, and again, in 2010, millennials had flip phones, which they would text each other to get together and do stuff. In 2015, everyone has a smartphone, which takes up 5 to 10 hours of their day. You see the graphs in the book. Time spent with friends plunges in the 2010s. By 2019, before COVID hit, teenagers were almost fully socially distanced. They had given up most of their time with friends. So yeah, is this going to warp development? Absolutely.
I want to zoom out just a little to look at the bigger question about technology and phones and all of us in terms of attention. You point out in the book that the tendency of the mind to get distracted and the consequent need to train the mind and sort of build that muscle of attention, it's something that philosophers and religious teachers have been advocating for thousands of years, well before the rise of smartphones. So it's like this technology has developed, appeared, that kind of speaks to our worst instincts in a way. And I'm speaking as an adult, not even imagining what a teenager whose cerebral cortex isn't been fully developed yet.
That's right.
This is a long-standing question about how to have a human mind in a world, isn't it? That technology is just sort of supercharged.
That's right. I mean, our minds are these amazing evolutionary devices that can think and imagine and create. But to be creative, you need a mix of, you need to read, bring in stuff, you need to bring stuff into your mind. Then you need time to process it and think about it and mull. And then you need time to focus on writing something, creating something. So, there's a lot of research on the creative process, and there have been creative geniuses, throughout history. But what happens after 2015 or after 2012, really? I'm shocked to find, I teach a course at NYU. I have an undergrad version, a grad version. My undergrads, they're lovely, they're wonderful. As we talk, I learn what their lives are like. And we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about the interstitial moments, that is, the bits in between other things. So it's like you're waiting for the elevator, or you're in the elevator, or you're in the bathroom, or you're waiting online, and there are all these little bits of 1 to 60 seconds in your life. And those used to be times when, you wouldn't do anything. You're just you and your thoughts. And we used to be in cars, and you were a passenger in a car, you look out the window, and you're thinking. So there was always a mix of, there was some time when you weren't bringing in content and your brain could process stuff. Many of my students have essentially 0 minutes in which they do that. Again, half of Gen Z say they're online almost all the time. So many members of Gen Z have never gone 10 minutes without stimulation coming in. So I think this is really going to be it is devastating, I think, to creativity, to serenity. This is just, the brain was not designed to work this way, and I think it's malfunctioning when you stuff it full of content all day long.
So for you personally, are there ways that you've tried to reclaim those moments or bring your attention back, in a deliberate way?
Yeah. I'm not, other than a little bit of Twitter, I'm not really on social media, so I've never had addiction problems. Although there was a while I was investing in crypto, gambling with crypto. I could see how that got addictive, and it took up way too much time. So I'm aware of I'm vulnerable to this too. But once I realized just how bad multitasking is and how much I multitask because I'm so driven by efficiency. So I'd say to myself, finish what you start. So if I'm doing something on my computer and there's always 100 off-ramps, do this, check this, click that. I say, no, finish what you start, stay on task, and then you can go back. That's one thing. Another thing is I've assigned my students for the last couple of years to do an awe walk. Dacher Keltner, my friend, an awe walk, AWE, awe. My friend Dacher Keltner wrote a great book called Awe. He and I did some research on Awe years ago, and he's really followed it up. And he describes the walks he would take after his brother died of cancer, of just, he lives in Berkeley, California, beautiful California coast. And he describes just the effect of just taking a slow walk, just looking at nature. And it was really healing for him. And a lot of spiritual practices are like this: slow, open, beauty, contemplative. And many of my students have never experienced this. And so I assign them, take an awe walk, do not bring your phone, no headphones. You cannot wear headphones. And for many of them, this is a new thing. They'd never been out without their phone, never been out without their headphones. And I found over the years, going to a park, nature is the best. We have some beautiful neighborhoods in New York City near NYU, so that works, but it's best if they go to a park. And the results are often transformative. It's a spiritual experience. They feel an opening. They feel love. They feel everything's going to be okay. Now, obviously, not everybody feels this, but I'm saying is just being open to nature is a really important part of being a human being on this planet. And so ever since I assigned that, and I did it myself, I realized, wait a second, I shouldn't always be listening to my the AirPods make it so easy to just always be consuming content, podcasts, music. And so especially, I live and work right near Washington Square Park. It's a beautiful park in New York City. And so especially when I walk through the park, the trees are so beautiful in this park. And so I really try to not consume content. I just look. So I'm doing some little things to try to reclaim consciousness.
And just to end, John, you'd be aware that the Australian government is in the midst of passing really seems world-first legislation around trying to have a minimum age that teenagers can get on social media. There's still a lot of debate about how that's going to work in practice. But is this an area that you think requires that kind of government legislation? Having set out the issues as you see them, the problems as you see it, is this something that individuals or individual families can take action on, or is it something that requires that kind of government legislation?
Yeah. So I wrote the book as an American, meaning I don't have a functioning legislature in my country. I don't expect the U.S. Congress to ever do anything. And so as a social psychologist, I wrote the book looking just at norms. What can we do ourselves? And so there are 4 norms that we can roll back the phone-based childhood, and they're very simple. The first is no smartphone before high school for us, age 14. I don't think we need a law for that. In Britain, there's been some talk of banning sales of, so I don't think that's the right way. Just the norm should be don't give your kid a smartphone before 14. The second was no social media before 16. Now, that's the one where actually we do need a law. So I did that in my family. It was very hard because I had to tell my daughter, no, you can't have Snapchat. But Dad, I'm the only one. Everyone else I'm cut. I don't know what's happening. But I had to stick to my guns on that. And ultimately, she actually agrees. She's now 15. She actually agrees it's a good idea.
Why do you think
it
needs to be a law rather than just as you did in your family?
Because it's really hard to tell your child, you're going to be isolated because I said so. It's really hard. And very few parents can do that. And it was hard for me to do it. And so the reason why all our kids are on is because everyone else is on. The reason our 10-year-olds now have smartphones is because every other 10-year-old has a smartphone. So it's a collective action problem. So the second norm is no social media till 16, but that's the ultimate collective action issue. If we had a law saying there's a minimum age for this, in the real world, we have minimum ages for about 4 reasons: graphic sex, extreme violence, addiction, and physical danger. Once your kid gets a smartphone, social media, they've got all 4. Our 10-year-olds are exposed to pornography, horrific, real violence, not TV violence, real people being murdered. Horrible, horrible things they're going to see. And there's no minimum age? This is insanity. This is the one place where we really do need governments to say, as they do about driving cars, drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, I think social media, there should be a minimum age. Children should not be on it. Right now, if you're old enough to lie and say you're 13, you can go anywhere. And that's crazy. And Australia is leading the world and doing a bold move, which is to say, we're going to have a minimum age on this. We have to.
It's a curious thing, isn't it, that we do accept those legal restrictions with alcohol, with driving, et cetera, with voting. And we know there'll always be some kids who wriggle their way through. Yeah. There'll always be lawbreakers, but that's a general accepted thing. It's a good thing to have the law and it can be upheld. Why do people seem to have this belief that we can't possibly apply laws in this realm? There just seems to be this really widespread attitude of we can't do anything about it. It's sort of like the tide that's bigger than any human society. I'm curious why you think that's happened.
Oh, the major obstacle I face as I'm part of a movement to roll back the phone-based childhood. The major obstacle is resignation, a sense of despair. People who say, oh, the train's left the station. The worst thing I ever heard was a woman, a so-called expert on child rearing, who said, we have to raise our children in the world that we have, not the world that we wish we had. To which I say, no, we can actually change this. The world that we have is completely toxic for children. It's doubled the rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, self-harm. So we have to change the world. And it's actually not that hard because this is only 12 years old. This phone-based childhood, it only came in 12 years ago. It's not permanent. We can roll it back. So just to finish up, the third norm is phone-free schools. It's complete madness that children can have a phone in their pocket. Now, the rule might say, oh, you can't take out your phone during class, but they just use it under their desk. Teachers tell me students go to the bathroom so much more often now than they used to check their phones. But Australia's done great on that. And then the fourth is far more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. If we're going to delay immersion in the phone-based childhood, we've got to give kids back childhood in the real world. We've got to give them back fun and excitement. We're hurting our kids at a massive scale. And we've got to change. We've got to roll back the phone-based childhood, restore the play-based childhood.
John, you've given us a lot to think about. I really appreciate your time. And now I want to set you free from Zoom to go and enjoy, Thanksgiving celebrations with your family. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Sarah. I guess I can't say happy Thanksgiving to you because you don't have it.
We'll take it.
But okay, happy Thanksgiving to you. And yeah, let's roll this back. We can do this if we work together. That's the key. It's a collective action problem. We can't solve it as individuals, but if we team up, if we work together, we can solve this.
This is Conversations with Sarah Kanowski. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app.
Jonathan Haidt was my guest on Conversations today, and his book is The Anxious Generation. This conversation was recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. It was produced by Alice Moldovan. Our executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sarah Kanowski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanowski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.